Okay, so today we're going to talk about shadow mapping and anatomy. Probably one of the most important things we'll talk about. And in my opinion, shadow mapping is probably one of the best ways to learn how to do drawing. And we'll get into that as we go along. So today, student will be able to break down a drawing into what we call a graphic drawing by separating the values into a light and dark family. And then the student will be able to describe the difference between a hard and soft edge and why those are important. So what is value? Value, real simply, is the use of light and darks in your drawing. You'll typically refer to these as shading or tone. In my opinion, it's probably one of the most important parts about a drawing. You know, if I say, hey, cut that out, and hey, cut that out, those are two very different sentences, even though they're the exact same words, right? And the difference between them is my tone, and I think value does the same thing for a lot of artworks. And so here we have a real simple value scale. A value scale is simply steps from dark to light. I would highly recommend, as you're starting these drawings, somewhere in the border, make a 5 to 7 step value scale. This way you kind of know how dark your 4B pencil can actually go, and you kind of have a little bit of practice bridging the two. We won't go as dark as your pencil goes, and you need to kind of know that. You know, if we're on a 5-step value scale when we do our shading at the end, we want to be somewhere in the middle, okay? You know, like a 3. We don't want to shade as dark as we possibly can on that. So there are a lot of terms up here. I think probably not all of them are as important for most of you right now. The big ones are, you know, you have light hitting an object. There's a side that is caught by the highlight, which is where the light's pointing to. There are halftones, which are in the highlight family, that transition to that core shadow. That core shadow typically has a reflected light. This isn't the best example of that. We'll show you more examples of that next week when we talk about reflected lights. And then that object typically casts a shadow on the ground or on the surface it's sitting on, and you can see that there on the table. A lot of the reason we do perspective and boxes first is because when you're mapping out your cast shadows, you can actually treat your light source as a perspective point for mapping those out, as you can see here in this image. They're mapping out where the shadow hits the ground by creating their own little light source and mapping it with all the corners. And then some of you aren't really ready to talk about edges yet, and that's okay. If this isn't making any sense to you, don't sweat it. Some of you are. A couple of you more advanced kids are maybe ready to start talking about this edges. And so edges are basically a transition from dark to light. And how you transition from dark to light can really help you tell what your object is and how angled its surface is. So for example, here in the middle of this A, you can see where it starts to transition from light to dark really softly and over a wide area. We call that a soft edge. On the right top right part of the A, you can see the part where it's the egg and the part where it's the background transition instantly. We call that a sharp or a harsh edge. Occasionally, and these are a little hard to pull off, but you'll find, like at the bottom right here, the difference between the background and the egg itself kind of blurs and disappears a little bit here. Your brain actually doesn't even notice it, it's just filling in that line for you. We call that a lost edge. It can be kind of hard to pull off in an artwork, but it can make an artwork look really beautiful. We also have what we call here firm edges. Shadows are typically firm edges because they're not quite sharp, but they're not quite soft either. There is a transition from light to dark, as you can see here with this shadow on the table, but it's kind of soft and fuzzy. And so that's kind of an important edge to distinguish from as well. And so here you can see someone doing a drawing of the picture on the top left. They're pulling. The way they handle their shadows and their edges tells you what certain things about the object they're drawing. So at the top, you can see the edges are very harsh. That probably tells us that that's some kind of cube with a shadow on it. But you can tell that there's a shadow underneath it because the edge is very soft. It's firm. I wouldn't say it's soft. It's firm. It's not as harsh as the edge at the very top. And then you can see that the object that the pencil's working on right now is a sphere, and it's a sphere because the edge is really soft and it slowly transitions from light to dark. And you can see that here as they're mapping out their drawing here. They're doing a drawing of a skull. Where A is at, you can kind of see that there's a hard transition. And I'll show you a picture of what the finished drawing looks like in a second. And so they're going to have a very hard edge there, whereas B is going to have a very soft transition. It's going to start very light and slowly get darker as it goes into the socket. And so when they finish this drawing, as you can see here, those edges tell us a lot about where those surfaces are in relation to each other, and how they turn, how the object kind of sticks out in some areas. So that hard edge where A was kind of tells us that that object is closer to us and has a really firm edge there that we kind of, that protects the eye if there was an eyeball in this skull, for example. And so what we're going to talk about today is shadow mapping. Is probably the most important thing. Shadow mapping is simply we're going to take the things we've already been doing. We've been drawing and bringing our drawings up with accuracy and comparing proportion. Now we're just going to go one step more, and we're going to break our drawing into a light and a dark family. Okay? And so you'll do that by starting with a rough gesture. Okay? After you start that rough gesture, just like we always do, right? This is what we did the first day we practiced drawing the toys. You'll then slow down and make corrections and increase the drawing accuracy of your drawing itself. Now, this is where you should be spending a lot of your time today. We're going to spend 2 days on shadow mapping these shapes, and then Thursday and Friday we're going to spend 2 days shadow mapping out a little still life. You should spend a lot of time in this making corrections and increasing your drawing accuracy phase. A lot of you skip this phase, and then your shadow shapes and your shading doesn't look very good, and it's because your drawing's not very solid. You need to spend a little bit of time on this solid, making your object look accurate. The more time you put in here, the better it pays off later on. Okay. Then after that, you'll map out your shadow shapes, paying attention to what type of edge you're mapping, if you know how to do that. And then you'll shade in your dark family, all one flat value. You're not going to shade in your dark family a very dark value. You know, if we're on a scale of 1 to 10, you're going to be like a 4 if 1 is the darkest your pencil can go and 10 is white of your paper. I would say shade in like a 4. We can always go back and make things darker if we were going to finish these, which we won't. But that's how you would. That's how we're going to break the families up. And so if you do enough of these kind of starts, shadow mapping, the finishes kind of take care of themselves. In my opinion, you should probably spend a lot more time bringing your drawings up to a shadow map stage and less time shading and finishing out a drawing. Your time would be better spent at this kind of level, just getting to a shadow map phase. We'll finish a few drawings, but a lot of them we'll bring to the shadow map phase. And so here I've started with a rough gesture. I've just kind of thrown everything in there. I've got something on my paper, right? That thing we practiced on the very first week. I even, if you're struggling with the cylinder, you can see here how I made it a box and then did my ellipses inside our ghosted planes and then connect those to make a cylinder, right? Those things we've been doing build up to help us make our drawing. Then I go in and kind of increase my accuracy here. I pulled out, you can still kind of see it there a little bit, the box over the top of the cylinder. I firmed up my lines a little bit, fixed them measuring, and kind of made my objects feel a little bit more solid, like they're where they should be. Then I start mapping out my shadows. And you'll notice that depending on the edge I'm drawing, I'll turn my pencil on its side and kind of map a very soft, flat, like kind of thicker line there to show that I'm mapping out shadows and not mapping out like a firm edge, like you can see on the rest of the drawing. And so once you get it all mapped out, there's really not a lot of mapping on this first one. There'll be a lot more mapping later on in the week. But I've mapped out the core shadow on the sphere. I've mapped out the cast shadow that the sphere is casting onto the black box or onto the cube. And then I've mapped out the shadows on the cylinder and its effect on the table. Then I go in and I shade the dark family all one value. I know there's a difference between the value, say, underneath the cylinder and the value that's the face of the pyramid. One of those is darker and one of those is lighter, but right now I'm just making them one solid value. And that'll hopefully help your drawings kind of pop a little bit. Then we can move on to our next drawing. We'll do a little bit one a little bit more complicated, one that has some more challenging objects in it that aren't just simple geometric forms. But, if you can learn to map out shadows and shade simple geometric forms, shading more complicated things is the same thing once you break them down. Okay? And so that's what I want today. I want to see that. If you're drawing at home, some things I've been getting a little frustrated with is I'm getting a lot of people doing like a 1" by 3" drawing. If you're drawing on an 8 by 10" sheet of paper, that's already way smaller than your classmates are having to do in class. So I expect you to use that whole paper and really expand your drawing out as big as you can. If you want large sheets of paper to work from, I'll gladly get you some large sheets of paper to work from. We can arrange to pick them up on a Wednesday. Other than that, I'll include this finished shadow mapped drawing. Do not take it any farther in this. Don't shade it out and make it look pretty. Just leave it here. And I'll also attach the photo to work from to Google Classroom.